Richard mentioned dialogue and conversations and how important they are. We're going to get the first one to you right now. Please do welcome the moderator, Eithne Treanor, to the stage. Eithne, how are you today?
Hello there, how are you doing? Great to be here.
Good to be
and
here.
So lovely to be here with you all. And again, I love the full disclosure from Richard. And a lot of people actually say the same thing when we ask them that question. They were like, ESG?
Well, it's amazing because the numbers are large, Eithne. To achieve the SDGs by 2030, 5 to 7 trillion a year has to be deployed. This needs to be done by business, right?
It needs to be done by business. And again, I think I'm very excited to see the business community just owning this. I think this is so important. Remember, as a journalist, when we were, doing the streets of London and, falling over CSR companies and saying, the CEO wants to talk about this, and you're like, yeah. Right. But now I think the ownership sits with the CEOs, and this is just what's really going to move this, and it is.
Great. Well, take it away.
It's so powerful.
Fantastic.
Great. Thank you so
soon.
much. And again, this is really all about leveraging the power of the capital markets. The power is in this room. It's with your colleagues. It's with everybody who knows how to do this. And we're pretty much ready to go. So let me invite my panel up here. We're really going to get into this conversation. We have so much to talk about. And joining us from HSBC, we have the Group Chief Executive, Noel Quinn, is joining us. From the London Stock Exchange Group. So Noel, we'll put you here.
Cameras are there.
From the London Stock Exchange Group, the CEO, David Schwimmer, joins us. Rishi Kapoor, the co-CEO at Investcorp. Hywel is with us. He's a UK chair for UK and Ireland, managing partner with Ernst & Young. EY is here. And Bob Welch joins us. Bob, of course, the CEO from Modern. You're going to hear a lot about Modern. For anyone who doesn't know about it, you're going to be beyond impressed. So we don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot to talk about. So, Noel, if I might start with you looking at ESG, looking specifically in terms of how we're going to advance progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals as well. Put it in sort of perspective in terms of what global corporations and the financial community can actually do.
Well, let me look at it from my perspective in HSBC, and we made a statement about 2 years ago, particularly on the sustainability aspect. And if you think about the 156 years worth of history of HSBC, we financed today's industrial base. That's what we've done. We finance the manufacturing base in Asia. We finance the Middle East and all of the oil and gas and the energy sector in the Middle East. We finance the industrial build-out that's taken place across Europe and the US. That's what we've done. So what I now want to do is to help that industrial base go through the next revolution, go through the next retooling of how industry serves the world and serves community. I don't want to walk away from that challenge. I want to walk into it. And for that reason, we said that we want to be a market leader in financing the transition from today's industrial base to the industrial base of tomorrow, which is lower carbon intensive, more environmentally sustainable, but also serving the needs of communities. And it has to be a just transition.
And we're going to talk a lot more about that, David. We look at the work of the London Stock Exchange Group and also all the companies, that you represent. One of the areas, and you're really adamant about this, I think, you're asking for it, but also maybe nudging, in terms of full disclosure. This, more than anything else, you say has to happen before we can actually move forward. Tell us about that.
Well, you started this panel by saying we don't have a lot of time. That applies to this situation. And as the world is trying to address the transition that Noel's talking about, move from a carbonized economy to a decarbonized economy, we do not have a lot of time. And there's a real urgency here. We could talk about tipping points and various other aspects, but just to get right into it, our role as an exchange, we are an issuance venue. We are a platform that helps issuers raise capital, helps capital providers allocate that capital. And there's an enormous need for trillions of pick your currency to be reallocated to form this transition and to drive this transition. So that's a big part of our role as an exchange. Another part of our role as an exchange in the London Stock Exchange Group, we are, by definition, we're an intermediary. We spend a lot of time with issuers, trying to help them understand what is going on here in the transformation. Richard talked about not knowing what ESG was a couple of years ago. A lot of issuers are having to adjust to a dramatically changed environment. And we are trying to help them realize that their approach to sustainability has a big impact on their cost of capital. The other side of the equation is the investors, the allocators of that capital. And we also work with them in terms of helping them understand this is a whole new burden on the market. It's a whole new burden on the issuers out there. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of confusion. We're trying to help them simplify that. And I would say the third aspect of this in terms of our role is to help the market get to a place where we have more standardized data and standardized disclosure. We can talk a little bit more about that, but that's a critical element in terms of getting the markets to the right place.
Absolutely, and also I think it's quite frustrating for many people because maybe we need a little more standardization within that. Now, talking about allocating capital, Rishi, you often talk about this and say, you know, how investment companies like yourself, you know, you have a privileged position in so many ways in terms of allocating that capital. You know, are companies doing the right thing, and what do we really need to make sure that we're doing? And maybe do it a bit faster. I think we're also hearing a bit of an urgency to it.
Well, the theme of urgency is coming out loud and clear, Eithne. But I'm going to start off by being a little provocative. I saw one of the taglines on the screen earlier. It said ESG investing. In my humble opinion, that's the past. Investing is what we are talking about. All investing has to incorporate ESG into it. Just like we say that investment is for the purpose of delivering return in a risk-adjusted fashion, well, guess what? One of those considerations has got to be to build in ESG into the framework of the primary purpose behind investments. I'm fond of saying, you know, making a statement, at least in coffee chats, let your capital speak for you, right? We at Investcorp, we are the shepherds of capital. Ultimately, that capital belongs to individuals, you know, like all of us in this room. It's savings channeled through pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, even high net worth investors, etc. And what are those savings for? They are there to protect and enrich the lives of future generations, right? And what kind of protection and enrichment are we going to provide if that capital is not producing a fair, a reasonable, an inclusive, and a habitable world, right? So this is not about ESG investing. This is about thinking about what investing really means and making sure, much like what we do at Investcorp, that it is part and parcel of your culture. When you invest, think about ESG in the same way that you think about risk and return.
And I think it's so healthy that we're actually beginning to see that shift. You know, this, Hywel, stay with us here, leads me on really, that I mentioned earlier. The CEOs have taken charge of this. And this, I think, is just so very important. You work with CEOs around the world. You know, we look at the shift, I suppose, in terms of who owns this. How much of a difference is that making now that you can see?
I think it's been huge. The acceleration over the last few years has just been phenomenal.
This is perfect.
There was a great quote that I like on Bloomberg. Kapoor said that the sustainability revolution is going to have the size of the industrial revolution and the speed of the digital revolution. And EY can trace our history back to 1828 in Glasgow with Arthur McClelland. And he was there to start with new founders of capital to drive the industrial revolution. As Noel, I was thinking when you were talking, Noel, about the 150 years of banking, our job as accountants over that period has been to provide confidence to the capital markets. And then as that accelerated then in the 20s with the limited liability coming in. Now I'm thinking this new sustainability revolution, the advice that we're getting asked by chief executives, help me now on that transition. How do I provide comfort on the disclosures that's going to be needed for the investors, for the bankers, for that aspect? And that speed has just been phenomenal.
And Bob, we have all the the key money players around here, but you're practically out there day to day, you know, running a business, and a business that sometimes maybe has a different reputation depending on who you're talking to. You're in the extractive industries, and you're also looking at great expansion, and you're looking at great exploration. So how do you do that, almost a two-tier plan, so to speak, in terms of making sure that you're doing that on one side and also building sustainability into it?
Is exactly correct. It's not only ESG investing, there's not a separate ESG investing. There's also not a separate way of incorporating ESG into our business like minerals and mining. We are going to find the metals and the minerals that are going to decarbonize the world, but we're also going to do it in a way that elevates humanity at the same time. Most of the minerals that are going to lead the decarbonization revolution are in emerging markets. And those same emerging markets who arguably have been exploited in the past are not going to tolerate it in the future. And we as an industry realize that, and we as a company want to be at the forefront of being the role model on how to do it. But it's not a separate department, it's not a separate function, it's not a separate conversation. It's embedded in everything we do, from the board level all the way to the operators.
Rishi, let me just come to you. You know, when we look at funds and allocation, there's lots of funds that have actually very publicly said, you're not getting our money. So, I mean, when we look at what needs to be done, I think particularly in the short term, I would say perhaps that decarbonization is probably one of the most important things to do. And, you know, that's an area that probably needs a little bit more funding right now. What do you think?
100%. And let me actually pick up on that. I think this whole idea of exclusion, you know, having exclusion lists, etc., it's a really blunt instrument, right? It's much more about figuring out how you can help businesses and consumers on their journey towards a lower carbon footprint when we are talking about the environment, towards a more inclusive setup, you know, society when we are talking about social inclusion and governance, etc. Now, you know, we at Investcorp, annually, we run a survey with our investors, trying to identify what is top of mind for them as they think about the next 3 decades. Not the next 3 months, not the next 3 years, the next 3 decades. And the top 3 trends that they identify and have consistently identified over the last couple of years have been, not surprisingly, AI, aging population, and climate change. I think one of the biggest opportunities in the next several years for investing and generating return is going to stem from decarbonization. The development of innovative technologies that will help companies like Ma'aden, that will help companies that otherwise may be on that so-called exclusion list, to provide an essential product or service that is needed by the world, but in a manner that is sustainable, right? That is what we are in the business of doing, not just simply saying, okay, no, you're shut out, you'll get my capital. That's just a very blunt.
And I talk to a lot of CEOs in the energy sector, and I think, you know, there's a frustration among them in terms of, yes, we're all focused in the one direction, but how are we going to get there? Noel, if I might talk to you about this. I mean, we hear a lot about green finance, but there's also probably a big need, and even as Rishi is saying, for more transition finance. And are we beginning to see that? Because it sounds like the narrative is beginning to get possibly a little bit more sensible.
Yes, which is basically
The world at the moment is very binary. Green is good, brown is bad. And you have to choose between those two extremes. And I firmly do not believe in that proposition. There are some projects out there and there's some businesses out there that are pure green businesses. That's fine, we'll finance them. But we have to put even more finance into those businesses that are on a transition journey, that they're modifying their current business model, their current technology base, their current operations from where it is today with its current carbon footprint over the next 30 years to a more sustainable carbon footprint going forward. And that's going to require huge investment. And therefore, as a CEO of a PLC, where there are lots of commentators saying you have to choose, walk away from brown, walk into green, I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually finance that transition, that journey, from where we are to where we want to be. That industrial revolution needs capital. We're a provider of capital. That has to happen in a space of time like we haven't seen before. There is no time to have a binary world. We have to have a world that transitions.
And again, I think we have a lot of work to do on perhaps the public relations image on that. Hywel, if I keep you on this one at the moment, and particularly, you know, Bob talked about the extractive industry predominantly in emerging markets. It's very different in emerging markets when we look at what needs to be done. How can we, you know, I suppose, approach investment in emerging markets? Because we can't do it with the same lens as in the developed market. What do you think?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I was involved 5 years ago in a project for inclusive capitalism called the Embankment Project, which was talking about how stakeholders will measure companies. And it was very much a developed companies with developed investment funds and developed pension funds looking at the value chain across that. At the time, we thought this is going to be very different in emerging markets, and that was why we were so excited about the opportunity to work with the Future Investment Initiative on new metrics for emerging markets, because you have to have a different lens. You know, an example I bring is health and safety. Most ESG metrics will look at health and safety about the control framework they have. Actually, in emerging markets, it's more about how you're working with your supply chain. What is the output? What is the safety output of the work that you're doing? And that's more important than your control framework itself.
Come in on this one. Forgive me, I'm having a little technical problem. We look at, you know, you talk about disclosure and you talk about companies, and there are a lot of people out there who are not particularly interested in funds, you know, looking at when there is going to be disclosure. I recently talked to somebody who has said that if you're looking at a gas and oil field right now, if you actually say it's gas with associated oil, you might get investment. But if you say it's oil with associated gas, it's the oil word's a bad one. But how are you looking at companies, and what can you do to actually make sure that this is a more realistic and inclusive conversation right now?
So just to pick up on some of Noel's comments, we have to engage with the companies that are making the transition. And it does not make sense. In many ways, in sort of the early days, if I can put it that way, of ESG investing, there was a lot of portfolio greening, but that in and of itself does not help address the issues. We've got 80% of the world's economy relying on fossil fuels. We can't just flick that off, turn a switch. This will be a transition that will take decades. And so working with companies in extractive resources, oil and gas, metals and mining, has to be the solution. And one of the things that I'm working on, I'm co-chairing the work stream at GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero, for real economy transition plans. So what that means is financial institutions like Noel's, like the London Stock Exchange Group, working together, coming up with guidance for real economy companies, particularly those in high carbon emitting sectors, aviation, steel, oil and gas, as to what the financiers and the markets need from those companies in terms of making transition plans. So providing that helpful guidance. We're putting the report out in September, so there will be that kind of clarity coming then. But that's one example of what we can do to work with the high carbon emitting companies to help make that transition.
And that's very encouraging. Noel, you want to come in here?
Yeah. Listen, I think there's a new feature of corporate governance that's emerging. You know, we all talk about our annual operating plans. We all talk about our 3- and 5-year strategic plans. You're going to have a new pillar to corporate governance, which is your 20, 30-year transition plan. And that is going to be a piece of disclosure that the public markets will require and the private markets will require. The more that you can describe the journey of your company and your business and your technological base over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, the more likely is you're going to have access to the financial markets. And that also, from a bank's point of view, look, my Scope 3 emissions are all of the emissions of my clients. I need to be able to describe the emissions of my clients to my investors and my regulators, to make sure that we are able to provide an effective cost of capital to my clients. The more I can talk on your behalf as an industry, the more I have the ability to continue to communicate to my stakeholders. And every other bank CEO is going to be in the same position. Every other pension fund is going to be in the same position. The more you can tell your story as an industry, the more then the financial services sector can support the investment profile of that industry.
And Bob, this must be encouraging
very.
to hear. Also, I think, we've talked before, and as you said, this is very much part of your license to operate, basically. And I think, again, we look at responsible companies doing the right thing. So you're not going to, you're being watched and you're watching yourself. I think that's important as well.
I think this has been a very encouraging 20 minutes of my life as we talk about the transition. And we've got a very ambitious goal, like many companies do, to be carbon neutral by 2050. And I can point to how to get there about 60% of the way in this very short time period. But to attract capital, I fully expect to be held accountable by financiers on, okay, how are you going to get those licenses? Well, to get the licenses, you have to be a responsible actor in emerging markets, treating people well, an employer of choice. So as we all make this transition, the companies that can demonstrate that they're serious about making the transition and have demonstrated capability and track records of success, even though they might not know how to get there, are going to be a lot more apt to be able to attract the capital needed to make the transition.
And, I think, again, we look at the industry, and I think sometimes the extractive industries and hydrocarbon industries have been treated like the bad child.
Right.
You did bad, you go in the corner, and everybody wants to talk about how bad you did, instead of saying, okay, people have taken this on board, they're actually doing something about it, so now it's about coming together and moving this on. Rishi, stay with us on this here in terms of, how do you actually choose where to invest? And again, I think it is about looking at emerging markets. It's very different. Where do you make, the decisions there, and how do you make them?
Well, so one of the things that I'm actually very bullish about as it comes to this whole idea of embedding ESG into your investment ethos is the fact that I think private capital is going to lead the way on that front. Because we have the benefit, Investcorp has been doing only private investing for 40 years, we have the benefit of two things. One is typically we have significant influence, if not outright control, on the underlying investments that we make. And two, we have the benefit of a long-term horizon, right? Typically 5 years, sometimes even longer than that. That allows us to, in turn, work with the underlying management teams of the companies with a solution mindset and the mindset of transition or journey that we've been all talking about during this discussion, rather than trying to greenwash, the outcomes or, just focus on reporting and monitoring as opposed to actual action. So when it comes to how we approach our own investing activity, it's a very different process from one size fits all, to be very precise, right? There is no one size fits all. Between regions, between industries, between companies, and between asset classes. What we've done at Investcorp is we've developed our own proprietary framework, borrowing pretty heavily from the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board and the UNPRI, which tries to make it a little bit more fit for purpose. In the emerging markets, for instance, we invest heavily in the Middle East, we invest heavily in India. We know that a focus purely on the environment alone is not going to be sufficient, right? In India, for instance, we focus equally, if not more, on the S part of ESG, because ethical procurement, sustainable labor practices, training and development, lives and livelihood, employability, has a much bigger bearing on a market like India than just simply focusing on renewable power generation. I'm not suggesting that's not needed, but I'm saying there is a very significant element of our investing activity, for example, in emerging markets, that focuses on the S and the G part. In the US, similarly, inclusion and diversity is a very big thing, Eithne. We might take it for granted sitting in this room with 40, 50 nationalities represented around the hall. But in the US, I'm proud. We are amongst the first ones in the US to establish and launch a platform specifically focused on seeding and developing asset managers from diverse backgrounds. That's a thing. Imagine, in a deep market like the US. So it's very, kind of fit for purpose, developed and tailored, depending on the asset class and the market.
And I think you're all going to want to talk about that. Hywel, start this one off for me. It's not just the E. You have to pay attention to S and G. And how are people doing it? Are they doing it right, and are they doing it fast enough?
The focus is at the moment all on the E. And I think about it as climate is the tip of the spear at the moment to do it. But we are going to move very quickly into the broader S and Gs. And we made a joke, Richard made a joke earlier about Elon Musk, and that's an example, I think, of those changes. So we do have to think in the broader aspect. And the way I look at it is you need to understand what your stakeholders want and what your stakeholders value. And they will vary by community and by country or within that local context. And having that analysis, you need to think about that. The transition plans are fantastic, but they've got to be careful they're not a tick box exercise, and that these are integrated in the strategy for delivering long-term value to organization stakeholders. And if we don't get that right, we're going to risk losing both the climate and the sustainability agenda.
Noel, you've been, your leadership role, particularly in breakthrough with the founder Bill Gates on this too. And as he said, no country, company or individual can halt the progress of climate change alone. And again, that it has to be widened into ESG. It takes, everybody. It takes private, public, everyone has to be involved in this conversation, and everybody has to be involved in the action to make it happen. Talk to us a bit more about that.
Listen, we're all going through a massive learning curve, and we don't have all the answers. Those transition plans will not have the answers for the final 10 years of the next 30 years. They'll have guidance, they'll have direction. Innovation is going to be the lead. Technological innovation is going to be the way to solve the problem of climate. And there's going to be innovation that needs to be scaled, and there's innovation that needs to be proven. And what the breakthrough energy is doing is really trying to bring technologies that are well developed and pretty close to being proven to bring them to scale. Because having a great technology but you don't have scale is no good. And what we're doing, we've gone in as an equity provider. We want to learn through that process. I'm going through a personal learning over the last 2 years at a huge rate of knots. We'll make mistakes. Our people, I've got 200,000 people I'm having to re-skill. They've known industries the way they've been run for the past 156 years. They need to learn about the industries that are on the horizon and the business models that are not yet proven, because they need to be able to lend into the future, not just continue lending into the past. And that's a huge reskilling exercise. And frankly, we're involved in that foundation because we want to learn. I want to learn. My team does. And it's a great way to learn.
And I think that's, for everybody in this room. And it's a bit uncomfortable at times, but I think there's no way back.
Life has been uncomfortable the last 2 years, yeah.
Bob, and also when we look at what's going on in Saudi Arabia, there's such a huge social change. Having looked back when I was there maybe 10, even 5 years ago, to see what it is today, and for people who, haven't been there, or haven't been there for a while, it's a whole different country, and it's got a big focus. And also, in an industry like yours, you're bringing new people in, different people. I see the amount of young women that are in engineering university there, careers that just were not there before. How do you bring... You almost have a double challenge on your hands to make sure that you're incorporating the E, the S, and the G.
Well, let me go back to one thing real quickly. We talk about discomfort, and the one size doesn't fit all. And we're looking at communities and jurisdictions where we want to mine globally and within the kingdom. We've gone from here's the number of jobs and economic opportunity we can provide, and we'll do no harm to your landscape when we're done. That was the old model. The new model is how many decision-making rights do we allocate to the communities and how we operate our mines and plants. That's craziness for a guy my age, but that's what's required. Back in your question about the excitement of what's going on in Saudi Arabia, I first was in Saudi Arabia in 1991 with the U.S. Army. And the debate when we were deploying to the kingdom was, should we be able to take pictures of our wives and girlfriends with us without offending our hosts?
Not your girlfriends at that time.
Yeah, and it was probably American immaturity as much as Saudi censorship. But that was a debate before we deployed. I was out with my wife in Riyadh this week in a chic sushi restaurant that would rival anything in London or New York or LA. My wife was amazed at the fashionable abayas, the excitement was going on. We made the reservations online, we paid online. It's a totally digital economy. It's vibrant. The good news is, though, the Saudis are not losing their fundamental faith, their values in their family, and how to bottle all of that up and become an employer of choice for young Saudis is one of the most exciting parts of this job. So that's, harness the energy of the youth of Saudi, the diversity, the gender equality movement, and applying that to solving these big, hairy issues that face the globe and the kingdom. It's tremendous.
Yeah, it is. It's an exciting time, but again, frustrating at times, nervous. It's got it all there. And we're in an exciting sort of rush to the finish here. So, David, in terms of, I want a sort of a bit of a call to action with you. Can please comment just in terms of the culture shift that your companies need, that everybody needs, but also perhaps leave us with a bit of a call to action in terms of what companies really can do, real practical steps.
So it's interesting. This is basically a private sector panel here. And I do want to inject into the discussion the policymakers, the governments. And while we've made a lot of progress and a lot has been pushed along with private sector focus, GFANS and other organizations, Transition Pathway Initiative, Climate Action 100+, we do need policy. We do need government action. And I touched earlier on data and disclosure. London Stock Exchange Group a week or so ago put out a call for action, as you say, in terms of governments around the world putting in place framework for disclosure around emissions. Aligned with the work that's being done by the ISSB, it needs to be economy-wide. It can't be just public companies, it has to include private companies. We have also called for governments to put in place mandatory climate transition plans. And we also think governments need to put in place requirements that companies disclose the allocation of green and non-green revenues. So all important areas in terms of disclosure. And there's a separate big topic out there just in terms of pricing of carbon.
And I wish we could get into that one. That would start a whole new conversation. Rishi, stay with us. We have the 30-second big call to action. What would you say, in terms of capital allocation to your colleagues?
Let your capital do the talking. I started with that. I'm going to finish with that.
Again, and I think that's very, very clear. Bob, again, what do you look at when we're, what do you want from investors as well? And what do you see that the public-private sector can actually make life, easier, but make it a win-win?
Well, I applaud your optimism that the government's going to help, but we can't even agree on who was the rightfully elected president of the United States 2 years into his term. I'm afraid it's going to be up to business to drive this change. And I want to attract capital. I want capital to come to those of us who are making the transition responsibly with a demonstrated track record of success and commitment.
Well said there. Hywel, again, you have many different clients. What can you tell them, and how can we all move, I suppose, a little bit more comfortably on this journey?
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about the Industrial Revolution, the comparison to the Sustainable Revolution, and how long that Industrial Revolution has taken. We've developed accounting disclosures frameworks over 150 years. We can't wait 150 years to get the sustainable frameworks that David's been talking about, the disclosure frameworks. And that's why I was so excited by the ISSB. But we're all going to have to work differently. And it's going to have to require brave steps, collaborative steps. And we're going to make some mistakes, but we've got to start experimenting very quickly because we don't have 150 years.
Can I add one thing?
Quickly, yes, please.
On that in particular, I said earlier I'm very bullish about the role that private equity, private capital can play on this front in this journey. I actually do think, however, that when it comes to standardization and disclosures, that's where the public equities and public companies will inevitably have to take the lead, right? It's not just policymakers and governments. The large public corporates, the S&P 500, the Fortune 500, they are going to have to drive the standardization because private capital can only follow on that front.
And we're going to hear so much throughout the day, on all of these points. Noel, I'm going to leave you the closing word here because, there's a lot of money available there, and how are we going to make sure that we get access to these funds?
A couple of quick comments. First, move off of ambition into defining the journey. So don't talk about ambition anymore. Talk more about the journey that you're all going to be on and define that journey well with detail. Second, I think is be brave. We're all CEOs, we're all leaders of businesses. You're not going to do this by consensus. There are going to be competing voices, and you're going to hear them all, and they conflict. And you've got to be brave, and you've got to have an opinion on where you want to be, disclose it well, explain it well, but be brave. Third, I think there is a role for government, and there's a little bit of frustration. It's probably why I'll never be a politician. I said at the G7 preparation to some ministers and leaders, I said, one sentence in a communique from you collectively can create a new market. A demand signal can be written in one sentence, and that for the aviation industry was sustainable aviation fuel, 10% fuel mix by 2030. One sentence can create a market. That demand signal then creates the supply of finance. Not all policy requires money. Some policy requires sentiment.
And I think it also requires great leadership. We're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you all so much, really. Noel, David, thank you. Rishi, thank you so much. Hywel and Bob, thank you all so much.